And of course, there were protests and counter-protests. But I would like to read out a statement that I read by someone who follows these matters after China's counter-protest, that China too has mastered the art of shrieking in pain while striking the enemy. So
try and create the resources to keep a tab on them. After all, that's what maritime domain awareness has to be. Without getting too excited about missing out on a particular ship at some time or the other, because it will happen. And the media also needs to be a lot more
nuanced.
Chill.
Yes, I think that would be better. Good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to have all of you back again for what is the fourth episode of Dabble in Dialogues. I'm delighted to have once again my co-host, Admiral Shrikhande, who's joining us for a discussion on a very topical subject, that is the recent circumnavigation of Australia by 3 Chinese vessels. So let me first lay out what exactly really happened. 3 Chinese ships, one Type 55 class destroyer, the Zunyi, one 54 Alpha Jankai II frigate, the Hengyang, and one Fuji class tanker, the Waishanhu, left Hainan sometime late last month or early this month on a passage that no one was really clear about at that time. Now, as they moved out, they split into 2 groups actually. The 55 destroyer, the Zunyi, along with the tanker, went north of PNG, whereas the frigate, the Hengyang, went south. And she passed through the Torres Straits. And I presume, the 55 being a new class of ships, they didn't want to get it in too close to Australia. That's the reason why she kept to the north and well outside Australian territorial waters. These ships thereafter moved on and RV'd together on the 13th of February in the Coral Sea. From there, they headed south, keeping outside the territorial waters of Australia, but inside the exclusive economic zone. On the 19th of February, when they were off Sydney, they turned eastwards and exited the EEZ. And thereafter, on the 21st and 22nd of February, they carried out a gunnery exercise. I mean, it's a firing exercise. One's not clear what exactly really happened over there. But there was a gunnery shoot for which they made some range clearance announcements on Channel 16. That was picked up, I think, by an Australian Virgin Airlines aircraft, which passed it on, and there was some disruption of flights because no one was clear what exactly was going on. From there, they proceeded south. They did not pass through the Bass Straits, but went south of Tasmania, went right past Australia, going past Perth, and are now probably very close to getting back to their base in Hainan. So all said and done, it's been a passage that would have lasted probably for around a month and a half. And if you ask me, 3 clear messages by this passage. The first is directed primarily against Australia, and probably to tell them that the Australian participating in FON exercises in the South China Sea and in the Straits of Taiwan is a two-way street. That there will be some sort of a pushback, and so far Australia has not seen a foreign navy inimical to their interests operating certainly along their east coast. But this is a new normal that has been set with this passage. The second is to display the long legs and the sustainability of the PLA Navy, and primarily a new class of ship, that being the Type 55 destroyer. And the third, I would say, would be messaging to the Pacific Island nations that their only benefactor is not Australia. And they can look towards China also to an extent of meeting their security needs as and when they emerge, as and when in times to come. So, of course, Admiral Shrikhande knows this area really well. He has been a defense attaché there and has been recently back, of course, from there after spending time in Wollongong University. Knows many Australian maritime thinkers and is in touch with them constantly. So I thought I will address this question first to him as to how did the Australians react to this? And as a follow-on question to that, this entire issue regarding warning for an exercise, what is the position of international maritime law on these issues?
Okay. Thanks, Monty. I think that you briefed the audience very well on how the tour by the Chinese flotilla is happening. I think it's called Task Group 107. I think, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. Now, the thing is that even in a couple of times in the last 5 or 6 years, Chinese ships have suddenly been encountered in Australian waters. In fact, one came very close to Sydney a few years ago, and they also sent another ship, an intelligence gathering ship, to monitor one of the multinational exercises.
Right, I remember reading about
on the east on the east coast that they hold every 2 years. I think Talisman Sabre, if I'm not wrong. So they've been doing this earlier. In this case, perhaps what is of interest is to add to what you said amongst the motivations was that just a while back, sometime in between the 10th and 15th of February, in Harbin, I think the Cook Island leadership and the Chinese signed a very important Blue Economy Memorandum of Understanding of agreement. And that really changes quite a few things. So in the capital of Cook Islands, which is I think an atoll of about 16 sort of islands and some smaller islets, quite far away. Now Cook Islands is nominally attached to New Zealand for foreign affairs, etc. But they are also sort of plowing their own furrow, so to speak. Now Cook Islands and this agreement took perhaps even the Kiwis by surprise. And there was some angst about that. So the timing of this, as you mentioned, they would have sailed, probably the flotilla would have sailed before the agreement was signed, with this purpose that we can go there, we can show the flag, we can fetch up where we want and do a little bit of what that needs to be done. So in terms of what they've done, as you mentioned, maybe a couple of surface shoots. By themselves, surface shoots, as many people, all of us who've been in the Navy would know, can be organized at fairly short notice. They are not in terms of surface-to-air missile firings by ships, which can go pretty high up and which could be a real danger to even civilian traffic. But in terms of, although it is not laid down anywhere in international law or in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, seamen should be prudent and they should take all precautions to ensure that nobody gets harmed inadvertently through the exercises that they carry out. So in this particular case, it seems that they launched maybe once or twice, some surface target that floats around and can be used for surface gunnery shoots. By itself, it has a very limited area, but maybe 10 or 12 miles, a few thousand meters up in the air, and more than that, it doesn't harm anybody. So they might have done that range clearance. Now, the other question that you asked in terms of international law, for the audience's benefit, there is the territorial sea, and the word territorial is very important. That is attached to that. All the others are zones. They are not linked to territory. So from the baseline to 12 nautical miles is the territorial sea, which where the coastal state has complete sovereignty. And that is a place where usually if foreign warships enter, they will as a courtesy, but not as a legality, provide prior notification that they are passing through a country's territorial waters. But by and large, this happens if you're visiting a port in those countries. So there would be prior notification and information available so that you can proceed ahead with the visit. The other navy, the host navy, will welcome you, etc., etc. So in this case, from 12 miles to 24 miles, we have another zone called contiguous zone, where there are limited obligations on the coastal state and limited rights of the coastal state for certain certain legal issues.
Right.
And beyond that, including from there, is the exclusive economic zone, which again is a zone, it's not territorial,
Right.
where navies can do pretty much what they like. So from 12 nautical miles onwards, as far as navies are concerned, the older term of high seas still applies. Whereas, if I remember right, Article 86 of the convention, of the Law of the Sea Convention of 1982, calls anything beyond the EEZ or the continental shelf, if it is beyond that, as high seas. That is open for all, for anything, and nobody needs to take any approval for anybody. Having said that, of course, there are now, the High Seas Treaty, so roughly called the High Seas Treaty, where people have realized that even beyond that, there has to be some cooperative agreed mechanisms for conservation of resources for the more lasting benefit of humankind itself. So I don't think the Chinese violated any stipulation. As you mentioned, I think they are also sending a signal that we can also do what we want, and they've done it in the past. So, in terms of legality, we need to know the law better. What happens now, and as I see what is coming out of the Australian media, is a lot of sort of loose interpretations are done about where does the law stand and what law was violated. Although from the government's point of view, from many naval commentators, many in the strategic community, in Australia, they have said that, we need to be a little more cool about it. These things happen, we do it elsewhere, and that's the way, naval operations work in peacetime.
If I could intervene, sir, are there any differences in the way the situation was? Because this firing actually took place, I think, roughly 350 miles off Australia.
That's right.
And maybe a little closer to Australia than New Zealand. But were there any differences in the way Australia handled the situation and New Zealand handled the situation?
I think New Zealand made stronger statements. The New Zealand Defence Minister, said this is not acceptable, or words to that effect. The Australians were more muted. Although I believe the Australian Foreign Minister did deliver some diplomatic objection in person to the Chinese Foreign Minister when they met in Johannesburg. I'm not entirely clear what the nature of that protest was, but this was possibly to convey that such actions are not appreciated.
Right.
From a national strategic perspective, what it would mean is that when we talk so much about domain awareness, maritime domain awareness, and ships are not helicoptered into a particular zone.
Yes.
They sail from a long way off. You trace their journey probably.
Yes.
So they have to be tracked, not necessarily 100% of the time and in 100% of the places, but there has to be some amount of information sharing and awareness. It seems to me that the Australians were aware of these ships. When matters sort of get into the media, then the media, can sort of create an impression that we were surprised, or country A was surprised by country B's ships. That may or may not have happened that way.
So coming back to the reaction, sir, I mean, as an outsider, I somehow get the impression that the reaction from the Australians was slightly uncoordinated, in the sense that I suppose this is how democracies work, that there's appeared to be some pretty strong reactions from some people, some quite muted, but one didn't get a sense of coherence all the way through of a standard sort of response to the way this happened. And of course, there were protests and counter-protests, but I would like to read out a statement that I read by someone who follows these matters after China's counter-protest, that China too has mastered the art of shrieking in pain while striking the enemy. So it's quite a funny statement. But would you like to mention somehow about the way the Australians have responded?
I think you made an important point about democracies.
Yes, sir.
It's likely to happen very, very similarly. And it has happened in India, not maybe in the maritime domain so much, but in across the border, when we've had, lots of skirmishes with China. So there is an internal domestic political element Elections are around the
Yes.
corner in Australia, and all those are factors where political parties have to politicize something. So yes, there is a lack of coherence, but that's also the benefit and the beauty of a democracy, that you get incoherent approaches, but yet the state
Yes.
somehow ends up being coherent in its reactions. The other aspect, I think, is that in the media, as well as perhaps even in sort of naval thinking, sometimes we tend to conflate the vast difference that lies in peacetime and what could happen in conflict.
Right.
So peacetime deployments are vastly different from conflict. We spoke about
Yes,
sea
last time.
control and sea denial the last time. So but when information like this comes into the media, it might almost give the impression that now we are at war.
Yes, yes.
And that is something that we should always caution against, because it's very easy to diplomatically escalate issues and give them far more centrality and importance than they deserve. So such things have happened in the past. I'm sure they will happen again. But the Chinese, I think, were clearly using this for certain political statements also.
Right.
And I think they have probably made that message clear. They've also made some operational statements, like you
Right.
mentioned, about freedom of navigation, etc.
Yes.
So they are exercising it just like others exercise freedom of navigation near their waters. And this brings to the other aspect of the confusion between right of innocent passage, which exists only in the territorial sea.
Right.
And I think, as I mentioned somewhere else, that the right of innocent passage is actually a right of sufferance. It sounds as if it's a very strong right for the ship that is transiting.
Right.
But actually, by acknowledging that you're doing innocent passage, by adhering to the tenets of an insurance
Yes.
of an
Of
innocent
it being
passage,
expeditious and
expeditious, you don't do any threatening maneuvers.
Yes,
You
sir.
don't even launch a helicopter
Yes.
or stop and exercise
Right.
at all. What you're doing is you're acknowledging the territorial rights
Of the nation state.
of that state.
Yes.
So you're actually, in some ways, in sort of ancient Chinese term, paying obeisance.
Right.
So anybody who does this in South China Sea,
Yes.
along disputed territory, and says that I'm exercising the right of innocent passage, I feel that reaction is exactly what the Chinese want, and it's music to their ears.
Right.
And some aspects have been discussed about this in amongst lawmakers and in terms of strategic thinkers, and in operational matters we need to be careful about that. The other aspect, of course, is that what happened here between New Zealand and Australia. There have been tensions between Australia and New Zealand on some of these issues. Australians have, for some years, probably felt that New Zealanders have been a little, too soft on the Chinese as compared to the Aussies themselves. There is some substance to that. Apart from that, like you mentioned, the complexities of the way South Pacific is arranged, and the decades-long rivalry between Taiwan and the PRC
Yes.
for getting recognition and being de-recognized from time to time.
Yes.
Then when another loan comes, the
Re-recognized again,
other side gets recognized.
Yes.
So the important part we need to understand on a strategic canvas, and the South Pacific itself is a huge canvas. Very high areas under the exclusive economic zones, rich fishing ground. There might be resources to be tapped in future. Many of the island nations are situated in bands of latitude and across longitudes, where space tracking
Right.
and the future of space will descend on the
Absolutely.
territory of these islands. And that is something that China, more than anybody else, has recognized.
Right.
China has not been the first one to recognize. France and the US
Yes.
recognize the value of some of these launch pads there.
Yes.
India has used these launch pads in
Yes.
earlier days. So space cooperation also happens, but space competition will happen
Yes.
in the South Pacific.
So again, sir, I mean, from an sustenance point of view, actually for the Chinese, I mean, the Type 55 is a large 13,000-ton destroyer. So being out at sea for extended periods, this is the way, ships are meant to be doing that sort of stuff. There were some rumors also that there might have been a submarine in company with them.
Yes.
I think some of these have been junked. It certainly couldn't have been a conventional submarine, because for them it would have been, a passage of this nature, trying to keep up with ships who are doing, even 12 to 14 knots, is a difficult task for any conventional submarine to accomplish. For a nuke, you could possibly do it, but even for a nuke, it's for any submarine really. If you have a large, if either a task force which is operating in an area, it becomes easier, because otherwise, if you're required to maintain a transit speed of around 14, 15 knots, then your sonar is blind most of the time, beyond your siren speeds, etc. So, to accompany ships in a passage of this nature, which is largely a longish transit, is not exactly a role that submarines are best suited for. Let me put it that way. And the other issue, of course, is that even though nuclear submarines can operate and are designed to operate independently for months together, but so far the Chinese have still been cautious. Where normally, at least in the past, we've seen that distant operations is normally a submarine tender which tends to hang around somewhere, if not in the close vicinity, at least in the distant vicinity. And since we didn't have any of these ships out, in my opinion, it's unlikely that there was a submarine also operating with part of this task group, sir. Yeah. But moving on, sir, I mean, if let's see that now they've done this with Australia, they've been to the they are in the Indian Ocean for, the anti-piracy task forces, I think, are going on for their 43rd or 44th, 45th mission, I forget the exact number. And from time to time, you have other vessels, you've had nuclear submarines, you've had conventional submarines here. You've not had a carrier here as yet. And you've probably not had a Type 55 destroyer, but the Type 55 is still new, and certainly it will come. It's only a matter of time before you have a Chinese carrier which comes into the Indian Ocean. What do you think? How should we react to this sort of a situation?
Okay. Yes, on the point of their nuclear attack submarine,
yes,
having accompanied or not accompanied, of course that remains open to question.
Yes,
we would not know. I've also read reports that it's likely to have been there,
yes,
and that's something about the strength of a submarine. A submarine missing from a base port or a forward deployment port and not being seen could be just about anywhere. A nuclear submarine. So the possibility cannot be ruled out. But it also creates more pressures for anti-submarine warfare capability and underwater domain awareness. So it is possible. A submarine does not have to tag along with either a carrier group, but it can operate in indirect support. And especially if a carrier group is going to be in business, then whenever a carrier is in business, it is launching and recovering aircraft actually in a small area.
Yes,
so it has to operate in a polygon. Otherwise, it's not in business.
Yes.
So launching into the wind, turning back, turning again, and recovering aircraft on a continuous basis. So this is the place where nuclear attack submarines or conventional submarines act in support.
Yes.
and screen the carrier, so to speak. In terms of either the Type 055 Renai destroyer or cruiser, whichever term one would like to use, it's only a matter of time when they will deploy. But I would say that we should not get too worried or too anxious in India or anywhere else about a carrier group operating, because they are bound to operate someday. And if we are in a state of peace, they are welcome to come. Is how I would look at it. If they come, we need to observe them, we need to track them.
Yes.
And that is something where, India needs a far more greater both, surface domain awareness, air domain awareness, and underwater domain awareness to keep track of what the Chinese may be doing. And in earlier cases also, when they've deployed an SSN into the Indian Ocean region, which is not again very close by, if you transpose it South Pacific or the Indian Ocean, they are at great distances. At great distances. So they have already done long-range deployments with the nuclear submarines. They have had, of course, a support ship docking elsewhere in Karachi and somewhere else. I think they went in. So that they will continue, and the support ship itself can stay out at sea for a long time. And you're right. I feel they've developed greater confidence to now operate perhaps their nuclear attack boats without this level of support as they did in the past. So if a carrier group comes into the Indian Ocean, as I think in a discussion I think 4 5 years ago, when suddenly the media in India went agog that the
Yes.
Chinese are going to come and they're going to set up an Indian Ocean fleet, I did suggest to the anchor of that program that uh, in peace, track them, keep a watch on them, let them do what they want, and we'll keep observing them.
Yes.
In conflict, if they deploy, we will do what
Needs to be
they
done.
would, what
Yes.
what needs to be done, including sinking their carrier.
Right.
So that's what would need to be
So
done.
I would tend to agree with you entirely, sir, that there's a huge difference between peacetime and wartime operations. So while the Chinese, as and when their carrier comes to the Indian Ocean, it can be used as an opportunity to understand and see and garner as much information, whether it be acoustic signatures, whether it be their understanding their operating patterns, whether it be their EM emissions that take place, their communication procedures. All this is useful information to have. And if you have a carrier group that is operating over here, uh, there's a, I mean, certainly if you're operating aircraft, you cannot be zip lip all the time. You have to communicate, etc. And it's good to understand these patterns and study how they operate. And in wartime, it's a totally different ball game, because operating on a sustained basis at 4 or 5 thousand miles from your homegrown bases is a complex task for any navy to do. And therefore, whether they come that time or not, I think is open to discussion and will have to be seen. But now, switching, tack, I would like to mention, you also talked about the Pacific Island nations. 22 different, entities, and they're classified both as nations and territories. 12 independent nations, 2 free association, which you mentioned. They have a free association with New Zealand, that is Cook Island and Niue, and 8 different territories. Uh, I think the real fascinating part is that their total EZ runs into 27 million square kilometers. I mean, if you see India at 2.3 million square kilometers, they are 27 million square kilometers of EZ, and all of them are extremely sparsely populated. So, tremendous deficit, I would say, in terms of capabilities and capacities that many countries have attempted to fill in the past. Most prominently, I would say Australia. But the new player, of course, is China. And China has been at it in the past also, but they seem to have stepped up their game recently. So right from the apex level, Xi Jinping has been there twice. I think in 2014 and 2018. Wang Yi has made frequent trips. His most frequent trip was to PNG in 2024. They have had numerous sort of agreements with these nations. There's always talk of a Chinese base coming up in Vanuatu or not. I mean, that has been in and out of the news. In Kiribati, there has been some sort of a security arrangement that they've signed, where Chinese policemen can, a certain number of them, 6, I believe, are permitted to be stationed there at any given time and provide policing support. The Solomon Island security deal, I think that was a huge awakening call for all nations. It was, I think, promptly followed by even Pompeo, I think, coming down to this to the area, and his first one of the first visits of a Secretary of State from the U.S. coming into this area, and interacting with I think he had gone to 3 of the Marshall Islands, Palau and Tuvalu. I think he had gone to these 3 nations over there, and then, of course, as you mentioned just last month, is the Cook Island Blue Economy deal that has happened. So I'm sure the country that is most concerned about this is Australia. Have they got their act together in trying to sort of combat the Chinese, or trying to, not combat would be the wrong term to use, but in at least trying to provide a viable alternative to the vast amount of resources that the Chinese can bring into this area?
I mean, you're absolutely right. The Australians are very concerned about their, declining influence, because for a long time they took that influence for granted. There were no competitors, and in many ways, and there are enough Australians who've written about it, that we went wrong in the sense we took them for granted, and not only that, we created the perception that they were in some ways subordinate to us, or colonies in that sense, which is what happened after the First World War, when German colonies were taken over and protectorates were established. So part of that, the Australians have realized that they needed to change their attitudes and perception and the way the Australians were perceived by these nations. And I think they did a fair bit through the last
Right.
a decade and a half. But that is the time when even the Australians are finding it very difficult to match Chinese aid dollar for dollar, so to speak. The Chinese have flooded the Pacific Islands, most of them with aid, and so did the Taiwanese. And I think some of the Pacific Island countries got used to playing both sides,
Right.
and this would be familiar to the dispensations in India itself, as we see what happens sometimes in the Indian Ocean region in some of the smaller island nations, which also there are perceptions that they also play this game between China and India. So yes, the Pacific remains a very interesting, a big canvas, as you mentioned. There is jockeying going on all the time, and this is a place where the Chinese leadership took a lot of interest at a time when the Americans, the Australians, and certainly the Indians were not really, visiting these places. I think an Indian Prime Minister went into the Pacific after around 30 years. That was in 2014 when our Prime Minister visited Fiji. So it was something. It's not that India did not or took them for granted. It is just that they were not painting on our the radar of our statecraft itself. That has changed. Again, India too, is dwarfed by the sheer scale
Right.
of Chinese efforts globally, and we see that
Yeah.
even in Latin America, South America. So, but there is also angst and anxiety about China being in the Pacific by the people there. So that works to the disadvantage, because the Chinese sort of Belt and Road Initiative targets, if one could say, the leadership. Of course, you must grant it that when the leadership changes, the BRI and Chinese statecraft now targets the new leaders. So there is some kind of continuity there. This is where I feel that the Quad is making some really good steps in terms of binding the Indo-Pacific together. And if you see in the last 2 or 3 communiques, whether the ministerial communiques or the president's the summit declaration, they talk about the Quad participating with IORA, with the Pacific Island Forum, and with the ASEAN to sort of bring all of them together in a coherent program. And I think many of Quad's programs are really going to bring benefit to the people. And I don't think we should spare any effort of giving that importance and that kind of funding backup between the 4 Quad members for these things. And that might be one way of in creating benefits for the Pacific Island populations, for conserving fish resources, which China covets more than anybody else, and for technical help, data connectivity, undersea cables, and for education. So in all this, Quad is, I think, doing a lot. Australia is doing a lot, and outside of Quad, India also is engaging through the Pacific Island Forum quite a bit.
I just had one sort of observation, and you can probably comment on that, is that from China's perspective, I mean, from a Navy perspective, both are distant operating areas, the Southern Pacific and the Indian Ocean. If it came, to me, it appears, even though the anti-piracy mission and their ships, etc., have been visiting the Indian Ocean, I would say far more frequently than they've been going to the Southern Pacific. But politically, I think their far greater attention has been given to the Southern Pacific as compared to Indian Ocean nations. So that's what I would say. And so, would you say that insofar as their in their pecking order of areas of concern, would you say the Southern Pacific outweighs the Indian Ocean?
It's a difficult question. You might have a point there. I feel Southern Pacific is an easier area for them to create, that kind of influence, because individually those countries are small in terms of population, and creating buildings like parliaments, hospitals is far easier there, including barracks for their soldiers, which they have done in many Pacific Island countries. Even 20 years ago, when I was the DA They were building stuff for their armed forces in some of these countries. So so the total quantity available, or I would say per capita attention,
is huge over there
is huge in the South
because the
Pacific.
population is small. Yes,
The populations are small. But I think the larger strategic issues
is
are
much
probably
more
in the Indian Ocean
Yeah,
region.
mainly energy, trade, all
Yes,
that sort of
energy,
stuff.
trade, political influence,
Yes.
and the competition between big middle powers and great powers. So I would say the Indian Ocean region, the Indian Ocean rim, the Middle East, West Asia, etc., are going to and are getting far more attention from Beijing than are the South Pacific. And yet, it's we need to recognize, as you mentioned, that the effectiveness of their attention in the South Pacific is quite high.
Right. So I think, sir, we've more or less run out of time. Would you like to recap on the discussions we've had today, sir?
I would say that nations and their navies need to calmly look at deployments by other nations with whom you don't get along too well. Try and create the resources to keep a tab on them. After all, that's what maritime domain awareness has to be. Without getting too excited about missing out on a particular ship at some time or the other, because it will happen. And the media also needs to be a lot more
Nuanced.
chill.
Yes, I think that would be better. Yeah,
chilled about such
because
things.
these are the high seas, and it will happen.
It will happen.
Yeah.
So the high seas are the common, are the maritime commons, and the cyber and space common, and the digital commons. So we have to have common approaches. We have to have greater awareness, and India needs, since you mentioned the South Pacific as a very important canvas, and it is very much so. India also needs to focus a lot more on the South Pacific. After all, the Indo-Pacific, includes the South Pacific, and devote a lot more attention. Look at capacity building for them, and build our own capacities also to be able to remain masters of where we need to be masters of.
So thank you again, sir. It remains for me just to, it's been a very interesting discussion. And I'd like to thank all our viewers as well for, taking the time out and listening to us. I hope you found this episode enjoyable. Don't forget to subscribe for our channel, and we look forward to having our next interaction soon. Good luck and God bless. Thank you.